Welcome to Hello Therapy, a podcast to help you take charge of your mental health through evidence-based psychological tips and tools straight from the therapy room so that you can live life better. What helps your mental health? My next guest, Sam Frerer, asked this question of her Instagram followers and got some really interesting answers. So in this episode, we discuss how these nuggets of advice can be turned into practical, actionable tips for your mental health. Sam is a psychologist based in Australia with a notable career as an army psychologist in the Australian Defence Force. Sam provides brilliant educational videos on mental health on her social media, and soon she is launching a mental health app called Psych Insights that will offer personalised self-help resources. Now, in this episode, we do touch on themes around mental health crises and suicidal thoughts and ideation. So if you are struggling with this right now and you think that hearing a conversation around that won't be helpful for you, do look after yourself and just come back to the episode some other time. So let's dive in. So, Sam, thank you so much for joining me on the Hello Therapy podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Sam. I'm a psychologist based in Canberra, Australia. So a very different time zone to yourself, as we've just discussed.
Yeah.
And I'm currently self-employed, but I've spent most of my psychology career as an army psychologist. So that was a very diverse, interesting role where I got to experience a lot of different types of psychology. So I did a lot of clinical work with clients and also a lot of organizational work. So like suitability assessments and things like that. And I've recently discharged as of a few months ago to take a bit of a leap of faith and do my own thing. So I'm launching an app in a few weeks, which I'm really excited about. It's all about personalized mental health support, which I think will be really helpful for people. I've been posting educational content on social media and just kind of taking a bit of a leap of faith and seeing where that takes me.
Brilliant. Yeah. And you have such a big following on Instagram. Are you on TikTok as well, or is it just Instagram?
Mostly Instagram. I'm on TikTok very intermittently and occasionally,
Yeah.
but not really. Instagram's kind of my thing that I've prioritized.
So exciting that you're launching an app because I think it's really needed, isn't it? There's so many different bits and pieces around self-help and there's so much out there now, but having it all condensed into one app, I imagine that's going to be so helpful.
Yeah, I hope so. There's a lot of people that are very overwhelmed by all the self-help resources. There's just so much out there. Some of it's a little bit contradictory and people don't really know where to start sometimes. So I think having it personalized to your profile and, what you're about and what you want to work on, I think that gives people a clear kind of starting point as opposed to being overwhelmed by the magnitude of resources out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And when does it launch?
So in a few weeks. So the exact date is to be confirmed because we're awaiting any technical difficulties on the App Store and things like that. But in a few weeks, it will be out. So very exciting. It's been a year in the making. So we'll see how that all goes.
Yeah, I bet it's been a lot of work. Is it similar to the videos that you do on social media, or how is it kind of set up?
So there's a lot of different resources. Like there's videos, there's audios, there's interactive activities, there's articles, there's podcast and book recommendations. There's so much stuff. And basically the user goes through these screens at the start and gets a psychological profile that tracks their like motivation, sleep, stress, anxiety, depression, a bunch of different things. And then they get matched to resources that match their profile. So that's essentially how it worked. It's a little bit complicated and it started as a little thing and then just grew into this monstrous complexity. It's been a lot of work. It's mostly been me and one tech guy doing this entire project.
Wow.
But we've finally come to the end of the process and we're really proud of what we've come up with. So it's been really cool.
Yeah, and a huge achievement because you say that is so much work and pulling everything together and just making sure that people can get the right support and kind of tailoring it to each person who uses the app. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, thank you. And we're hoping to make it as user-friendly as possible. It's a little bit of a complex idea, so that's kind of been the sticking point now, just making sure that people understand where to go and it's easy to navigate. But hopefully we've sorted that out. We've got friends and family testing it now, and they've all approved. So that's a good sign. So we'll see how it goes in a few weeks.
Great. Well, we thought today that we would take an idea of I think it was a few days ago, your stories on Instagram where you asked all your followers, what is the best piece of mental health advice that you've had? And you've got a really engaged following. So there were loads of responses, which was brilliant.
Yeah.
But I thought we would take some of those responses and discuss around it and just sort of have a think about what that piece of advice is and maybe link it to theory and practice and things like that. So shall we dive in?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. So some of the things that I pulled out, the first one was, don't believe everything you think. Thoughts are just thoughts.
That's a big one that I emphasize on social media. I think a crucial first step in managing distressing thoughts is to acknowledge that thoughts are just thoughts and they're not necessarily facts. Thoughts can feel very real a lot of the time, but that doesn't mean that they are real. And I think that the more that we buy into thoughts, the more that they become like this and they just dominate, our emotions, how we feel, how we respond. So acknowledging I'm having a thought that's not necessarily a fact can help bring the thoughts from here to here and just create some space and some distance.
Yeah. And I pretty much talk about this idea every day with my therapy clients. And it's a great idea from acceptance and commitment therapy, isn't it? Or ACT for short. This idea of how we get so fused, as you say, you were putting your hands up there to your face, like we get so caught up in our thoughts, particularly distressing, difficult, anxious, negative thoughts. Those tend to be the ones that we really do get what we call fused with, so that we believe them 100%. And actually, when that happens, we end up becoming so kind of rigid in our thinking that we get dictated to by these thoughts, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a really good exercise that I like is just to add I'm having the thought before the thought itself. So if you're having a thought like I'm a failure, just make that I'm having the thought that I'm a failure. And just little linguistic things like that can make a massive difference to how you interpret thought and just allow you to take a step back and regain a sense of control.
Absolutely. And as you say, those really simple strategies, tricks, tips can make a big difference, because that one there, again, that's something that I talk about a lot. What it does is it just takes the sting, it takes the power out of the thought. So if you're having the thought, I'm useless, for example, then if you say, instead, I'm having the thought that I'm useless, it doesn't quite have the same kind of punch to it.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily like an objective truth. It's, a thought. And it may be true, it may not be true, but it just kind of takes the absolute truth out of it.
Yeah. And one of my favorite exercises, mindfulness type exercises to do with clients that I advise clients to try and practice, is leaves on a stream. And I know that you've also talked about that in your videos, haven't you?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. I love visualization techniques. I'm a very visual person. So I think that's really powerful to envision putting on a leaf and watching it float down a stream, or as a cloud, floating through the sky, or a car driving away. Just actually seeing your thought, like physically leaving you, can be very powerful.
Yeah. And something that I talk to my clients about is, if they've got a particularly kind of sticky thought, is to try and imagine writing it on a helium balloon and then visualize yourself letting go of the balloon. Just watch it float in the sky. Because as you say, visualizing your thoughts can be really helpful and helps you take that kind of step back from it, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and another one, writing it on a piece of paper and then throwing the piece of paper away. Like there's all these little things like that I've learned about in ACT, and they're so powerful, where you can actually see a visual representation of your thought actually leaving you. So it's good stuff.
And even just writing your thoughts down. I think that's why journaling can be so powerful. It's like actually seeing your thoughts on paper. I think when you write it on paper, it's more powerful. So you can see that they are language and therefore just words and sentences.
Yeah, externalizing your thoughts is really powerful. Even speaking them out loud as well and hearing it as language. I think that's really powerful, to take the chaos out of your mind and actually see it as tangible words on a page. That can do a lot of good.
Yeah. So, okay, the next one then is, your diagnosis is not your identity. So what do you make of this one?
I think diagnoses are a bit of a double-edged sword, in that I think on the one end, it can provide a lot of clarity for people and explain their symptoms and help with treatment and navigating things. Like, for example, I was diagnosed with ADHD last year, and that was actually really helpful to make sense of what was going on for me. But on the other side of things, I think it can really quickly fuel limiting beliefs. such as I'm depressed, so I'm never going to achieve this, or I'm really anxious, so I'm never going to be a good public speaker, or whatever it might be. That when we become too fused to the diagnosis and it becomes our identity, it can really keep us stuck where we don't think that we can change. We're just kind of stuck in that pattern.
Mm. And I come across this in my work, particularly when I'm working with individuals who have diagnosis of depression or particularly bipolar disorder. That seems to be quite a difficult diagnosis to be diagnosed with because there's so much stigma and therefore shame that can come along with it.
It's interesting that different conditions have different stigma associated with it. Like with ADHD, it's actually interesting. People are actually quite proud of their ADHD online and kind of promoting it as I'm really creative, like, look at me. Whereas some have a lot of stigma associated with them. So it's really interesting how they're all quite different.
Yeah, and I think you can go through a bit of a process, can't you, if you are diagnosed with some kind of psychiatric diagnosis, in that I think there can be a bit of shock in the beginning. Particularly, I think what I'm holding in mind there is individuals that I've worked with bipolar, and sort of coming to terms with the fact that there is this sort of label in their lives and what that then means for them. And certainly with ADHD, I think you do go through a bit of a process there, don't you? Because you may sort of know that you have ADHD, but maybe you didn't get a formal diagnosis. And when you do, it can be a real relief. But also, I think there's a bit of reflection around, well, what does this mean for me and for my life?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, it was quite positive, but I can also see how it would go the wrong way where people are like, I have ADHD, so I'm always going to be disorganized, or I have depression, so I'm always going to be like this. And they don't see the potential for change when they just see that as part of their identity. So I think it's a double-edged sword. I think it kind of go both ways depending on a lot of different factors with that.
Yeah. And as you say, being able to hold whatever label you have, whether that's a diagnosis or label of useless, for example, holding them lightly rather than tightly. And that, as one of your followers has said, it's not your whole identity. Like, it's part of your experience as a human, but it's not the whole of you. There are so many other different parts. And I often sometimes get people to think about it in terms of a pie chart, draw out the different parts of you, what makes you you. And okay, so the diagnosis bit or the mental health problem that you're experiencing might be a tiny slither of that pie chart, but what about all the other parts of it? And that, again, a visual representation of, actually, I'm much bigger than this diagnosis, this identity that I have.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Like, knowing that I'm more than my depression, like, I have that condition, but that's not who I am. I think that's really powerful.
Okay, so moving on then, you can't control how other people feel about you. What do you say to that one?
I think a lot of us live our lives trying to please other people and to fit molds and expectations that other people set for us. And I think ultimately it's really liberating just acknowledging that not everyone's going to like you, I think, we're all unique. I think it's just so important to be yourself and try not to, change yourself to please other people, because ultimately you can't please everyone, and you can't control how they feel about you. So I try to really emphasize that on social media. I'm a little bit quirky, a little bit weird on my stories, and I embrace that. I think that's really important to kind of be who you are.
It's so interesting that you say that, Sam, because I wouldn't say you're quirky or weird on your stories.
That's interesting. I feel like there's a big dynamic between like my videos and how I am on stories. But maybe that's just in my head. Maybe I'm making that up.
Oh, I think you come across just really personable and friendly, and really wanting to help people.
Okay, well that's what I'm going for. So that's good. That's a big part of who I am. But I see myself as a little bit quirky. Maybe some stories that you haven't seen or something like that. But yeah, a little bit of an oddball, but a lovable oddball. So all good.
But as you say, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, we all hold certain narratives and stories about ourselves, don't we? And our brains have evolved to compare to other people. Like, it's a way, one way that we've survived as a species. If we don't know how we are doing in relation to the sort of the group, then that's very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have the negativity bias as well. So we're always going to see ourselves as inferior and always be quite harsh on ourselves. So I think that magnifies everything. And we see the highlight reels and stuff on social media. It's not a very fair representation of people's lives. So the comparison trap is a hard one to fall into, I think. comparing yourself to your old self and kind of running your own race is really important. But as soon as we get into the trap of comparing ourselves to others, it can be a bit of a downhill battle sometimes.
Yeah, and I did an episode on this about, if you constantly compare yourself to others, then try these strategies. That's episode 3 if anyone's interested. But we essentially, we can't control how we exist in the minds of other people. So we can have an idea about how other people see us, but that might be completely different. And I think our conversation just there
Yeah, it's
about
interesting.
your perception of how you come across, like that really shows that, doesn't it? And I think being aware of how much you compare yourself to other people and whether that is helpful or not, because there is helpful comparison, isn't there, where it can sort of help us feel like we're doing okay in life and things like that. But when it's unhelpful and you constantly feel like you just don't match up, you're not good enough compared to others, like that's when it just doesn't help you move forward in life.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the people that we look up to, sometimes we're really inspired by them, but sometimes it just makes us feel inferior. So I think it's really important to just be mindful of how you're comparing yourself to others, making sure that you're surrounding yourself with positive influences. And I think running your race is really important, and working on self-improvement and becoming a better version of yourself as opposed to trying to match someone else.
Absolutely. Okay, so the next one was speak to yourself as nicely as you would speak to others. Change your self-talk. This is a huge topic, isn't it? Because for me, it's just self-compassion, right? So what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I'm going to do a post on this definitely, but it's really interesting how we're so harsh and unforgiving to ourselves. Yet if someone else makes a very similar mistake, we're very supportive and encouraging and forgiving. And it comes back to that negativity bias and, that sort of stuff as well. But I think it's so important. If we can treat ourselves like we treat other people, that will just make a world of difference to how you feel and how you go about things. I think it's changing your self-talk is everything. I think that's so important to be mindful of how you're talking to yourself. And that's a really easy thing to just look at how you're speaking to other people and then apply that advice to yourself.
But it's hard to do, isn't it? I think I tend to come across two types of people, which this is a huge overgeneralization, but generally speaking, you've got people that either don't really have an awareness of how they talk to themselves in the first place, or you've got people that are quite self-critical. And obviously in my work, I work with highly self-critical people. So I talk about self-compassion all the time. So that ability to, be sensitive to your own distress, to care for yourself and for your well-being, to be able to tolerate your distress, to be able to sit with it. That's a big part of being self-compassionate. To have sympathy for yourself, to feel moved, to take action to alleviate your distress, and to be non-judgmental and empathic and understand and validate your own emotions and experiences. Like all of that is so key, but it's hard to do, isn't it? We have blocks that get in the way. It's a big part of my therapy work, actually. It's sort of trying to work out, okay, so we've got this idea that you can, you just need to be self-compassionate, or you just need to talk to yourself nicely. But that's not easy to do. And why isn't it easy? Is it because you feel like you don't deserve to be nice or kind to yourself? Or do you feel like if you let go of the inner critic or the self-criticism, that will somehow be detrimental to you? So there are a lot of people that are self-critical because they feel that it pushes them forward, it helps motivate them. Most of the time that it's just not helpful because it creates so much suffering, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, defense was very much like that as well. Army is a very regimented, strict environment. And people used punishment and being really regimented and strict to try and be a motivator. But they found that doesn't really work. It's just like if you're going to the gym because you hate yourself and you hate your body, that's a very different thing to wanting to improve yourself and wanting to be healthy. I think it really changes the source of motivation for you.
And you have also had a life as a personal trainer as well, haven't you?
I have, yes. So I've done a few things in my life.
I'm bringing that in because I was thinking there about like when you've been working with people and if you have noticed that they're quite down on themselves, like how have you used self-compassion to sort of help them motivate themselves? Have you brought that into your work as a personal trainer or not really?
A little bit. I like to kind of, I guess, walk the talk myself. Like I like to normalize things, especially on social media. Like, I'm very open that I've struggled with anxiety in the past. I've struggled with ADHD and certain things. And I think people understanding that, I'm a psychologist and I struggle with things, that normalizes things and helps people to understand that what they're feeling is okay. Like them being hard on themselves. It's just all humans are hard on themselves. All humans go through
Yeah.
things. And as a personal trainer, I like to kind of do the same thing as well, where I would smash myself in the gym and I would go through discomfort to kind of show my clients that, this is really miserable, but I can do it and you can do it too. So I try to kind of lead by
Yeah.
example when it comes to both of those sorts of things.
That's so true, isn't it? And, I am not a perfect person and I do struggle with self-criticism sometimes. And yeah, it can really catch me when I feel like I've made some kind of mistake or haven't done such a good job in something. And I do, even now, even through all the work that I do and the therapy that I've had in my life, I still have to check myself and go, okay, I'm really noticing my inner critic is really loud today. What can I do about this? How can I support myself? That's the question that I say a lot in my therapy room. It's ask yourself that question. How can I support myself with this in this difficult moment? How can I help? What
Yeah.
help do I need? And how can I get that?
Yeah, it's great. It's been a big test for me on social media as well, because like I'll post a video and I'll get 50 great comments and I'll get one bad one and you just fixate on the bad one.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important to notice that you're doing that and take a step back and say, wait, this was a good video. I got so much support and I was really
Mm,
proud of the message that I put across. And not everyone's going to resonate with the advice that I put forward. And,
yeah.
it's we're like magnets. We're drawn to the criticism in the bad. But I think it's really important to take a step back when we notice that we're doing that.
And I think what I would say, if someone is struggling with this and they do want to try and change their self-talk, is again kind of going back to that idea of like writing things down and being able to notice what your negative or unhelpful self-talk is like. So maybe, if you're in a difficult moment or you're feeling really bad about something, just get out a piece of paper or notes in your phone and just jot down, what is my mind saying and how am I feeling? And through that process and over practice and over time, you'll be able to really hone in on, there's my inner critic. And maybe giving it a name or just a label as like your inner critic can be helpful too. There's my inner critic again.
Yeah, separating it. Yeah, and it's helpful to make sense of where it came from, because often it's like internalized voices from our childhood,
Yeah.
like harsh parents and critical teachers and things like that. And actually identifying that can help you to realize this isn't me. This is a voice from someone else that I've internalized.
Yeah, that's so helpful, isn't it? When you can, again, in a difficult moment, kind of go, oh, no, these are like ghosts from the past. Like, this is something from my past that's coming in. And me buying into that right now isn't going to help me move forward. Or it's not going to help me be the person that I want to be, thinking about values.
Yeah, I love that. Like the key act question, is this helpful? No, and learn to let it go. So I think that's a really
Yeah,
important question.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so number 5 then. Don't let others' comments take control over you. You have control over how you respond and react. So what about this one?
So I guess first and foremost, I would recommend don't take criticism from someone that you wouldn't take advice from. On social media, like we're bombarded with people that, not
Yeah.
qualified psychologists that are criticizing certain things. And I think it's really important to be mindful of who you're listening to. But if you do kind of respect the person, looking at things, I guess, more objectively and trying not to take things so personally. I think with criticism, if someone criticizes something we've done, it's so easy to be like, oh my gosh, I'm a failure, and really take it on, your sense of
Yeah.
self. But I think it's really important to see the constructive in that. But yeah, overall, I think, focusing on what you can control is just so important in life in general. It's the difference between
Mm,
worrying and problem solving, essentially. So this is just one of those examples where focusing on what you can control is just so much more empowering than worrying and going
yeah,
around in circles.
absolutely. And I think here I want to just to differentiate between responding and reacting,
Mm.
because for me, responding is more thoughtful and thought through, isn't it? It's I am choosing how I respond in this situation, whereas reacting is a much more kind of impulsive thing, isn't it? It's more based in emotions, I think. So again, in my therapy room, I talk about there is a difference between responding and reacting. And actually, if you
Mm.
can pause, take a breath, notice what's happening in your mind and how you're feeling, then you can choose how you respond in that situation. So you're not like a puppet on a string with the thoughts that are saying, you've got to go and do this, you've got to do this, or the emotions are pulling you in a particular direction. You can separate from that so that you can choose how you want to respond in terms of the kind of person that you want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the power of the pause is such, even just a few seconds to notice what you're feeling and just experience the sensations as opposed to just emotion act, just breaking that link, giving your thinking brain, time to come back online again. Just pausing, taking a couple deep breaths can make a massive difference between reacting and responding, as you said. So the pause is a very powerful thing.
And that classic exercise or strategy from Russ Harris, who is an Australian and has written loads of books on ACT, the pause, breathe, notice and name. So that's my go-to strategy, where you pause, you take a breath, you name what's showing up for you, whether that's thoughts or feelings or thoughts and feelings, and then you can sort of respond in a much more values guided way.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Russ Harris. I've attended a lot of his workshops, and he makes things so simple and easy to understand with his analogies and things like that. So what you described, that's really simple that clients can, even when they are in the midst of an emotional tidal wave, they can just go through those steps and calm themselves down. So that's good stuff.
Yeah, and just naming what you're going through is super helpful, isn't it? Even if it's just, here's anxiety, or here's panic, or my mind is saying X, Y, Z, just having doing that process of naming, it's an act of self-validation, isn't it, really?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it helps you detach as well. Like, I'm not the emotion, I'm having the emotion. And I think it's really powerful to feel the feelings as well. Like, if you're feeling angry, what does that feel like? Like, is it a tightness? Is there a heat? Are your fists clenched? Like, actually go through your body and just become curious about all the sensations that you're feeling, and just sitting with the feeling as opposed to trying to get rid of it or acting on it.
Definitely. And that brings us nicely onto your another follower's comment, which is, feelings are just feelings and they pass after 90 seconds. And there was another one that said, feelings are not facts. So I think this came out of a particular video of yours, wasn't it, that was very popular. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so there was research done by Dr. Jill Bolt-Taylor. He's a neuroscientist. And she found that the average lifespan of emotion is 90 seconds, in that you experience a 90-second chemical reaction. And if you experience the emotion for longer than that, it's because your thoughts and actions are adding fuel to the fire and keeping that emotion going. So, for example, if you're driving to work and someone cuts you off in traffic, you might feel a wave of anger, but you don't just allow that to naturally dissipate. You think, oh my gosh, he's so inconsiderate. What an idiot. I'm going to be late for work now. And you just keep going with your thoughts and actions that keep the anger going, as opposed to just letting it naturally dissipate.
Yeah. And so again, we're coming back to that idea of being able to separate, to slow things down, so that you can just let the emotion kind of wash over you, really. And I talk a lot about, I think you've talked about this in one of your videos, urge surfing, and being able to, seeing emotions as waves, I think, again, is a helpful visualization in terms of it builds and it builds and it builds. There's a peak where it feels really tough if it's a difficult emotion, and then it will always dissipate. And it's sort of how you manage those waves when they come, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think in the midst of an emotional tidal wave, it feels like it's just going to last forever, and it's just a part of who we are. We have to deal with this. But in reality, everything, it's just like a wave. It goes up and it goes down. And if you can just sit with it and ride it out, it will eventually dissipate. So I think that's really reassuring to tell yourself when you're feeling those really intense emotions.
Definitely. So the next one then, I really like this one day at a time. That it's okay to take your time. Baby steps are completely acceptable during mental health crises. So what do you make of this one?
I think slow and steady wins the race when it comes to improving your mental health. I think it's so important to just take slow, consistent, manageable steps. And consistency compounds, like just making a few changes and building on that over time can lead to really big results. I think a lot of us in psychology and in fitness, whatever the realm is, we get in the habit of wanting results now and taking these big strides forward that aren't sustainable. And we go through these fluctuations as opposed to making really steady progress. So I think when it comes to mental health in particular, I think it's important to just focus on a few things and do them well and just really slowly and gradually build. as opposed to taking these big steps, which probably won't be sustainable.
And I think just picking up on what one of your followers said there about a mental health crisis. So I would define a crisis as, someone who perhaps is having suicidal thoughts, doesn't want to be here anymore, or is perhaps having thoughts around harming other people, is really experiencing, severe depression or perhaps anxiety as well, doesn't want to get out of bed, isn't looking after themselves, self-neglecting. So that's the kind of picture for me in terms of what a mental health crisis means. And whenever I'm working with people who are in that space, something that you'll hear me say is either one day at a time or 1 hour at a time. It is so important to try and just, take it one step at a time, but making tiny, tiny changes. So if you're in the depths of depression and it's really hard to get out of bed, then just spend, 10 minutes. Just spend 10 minutes out of bed on the first day. Next day, 15 minutes, and just gradually build it up. And certainly when I'm working with people who are depressed, it's sort of behavioural activation stuff around, let's really try and change the behavior first before we even start thinking about the thoughts that are showing up for you. And also sort of get, if you're in a mental health crisis, getting support is really, really key as well. But yeah, that one day at a time, it's so important, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. I think that's the reason we become overwhelmed, is because we're looking too far ahead and we think of everything that could possibly go wrong along the way. So that's my best advice with anyone feeling overwhelmed with anything, just to take things one step at a time and focus on that next step. And I think in someone in a crisis situation, just focusing on the small wins, as you said, getting out of bed, drinking a glass of water, whatever it might be, just really celebrating those little victories. And it's kind of like a snowball rolling down the hill. Like, there's going to be ups and downs, but once you get a little bit of momentum, it becomes a little bit easier to take that next step, can generate some momentum that way.
Yeah, and that's really important, that point that you made about celebrating the wins, because particularly if you are depressed, you're going to be thinking in a very negative way, generally speaking. And therefore, it's going to be very difficult to recognize the tiny wins or the small wins. I was out of bed for 10 minutes today. Like, that's a massive win. That's a massive achievement. And often in therapy, I see my role as, being the person that says, that was amazing, brilliant, keep going with it, and pointing it out, how well they're doing, even though it feels like, they used to be in a full-time job and now they can't get out of bed. Like, there's that very negative thinking that comes in. And if you can just go, well, okay, but being out of bed for 10 minutes is a huge achievement. Let's focus on the next goal after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to normalize setbacks as well. Like, I've worked with a lot of clients and I've never seen completely linear progress. Like, there's always ups and downs. They're learning opportunities, but I think we can get so hard on ourselves when we make a mistake and we slip up and we feel like we're going backwards. And I've done a video on this. It's called the what the hell effect, where one small slip up leads to just completely derailing everything. So I think it's really important to normalize, okay, I've made a mistake here. What can I learn from that? And then just to get back on track. Setbacks will happen. Mental health progress is always going to go a little bit up and down, but I think it's really important to normalize that and learn from it and get back on track when you can.
Yeah, and I always find it interesting how, there's so many posts, isn't there, on social media about the the kind of graph of healing isn't linear, and there's always another graph with like a messy line. So you've seen that stuff, right? Like, rationally, okay, yeah, healing isn't linear and it's a process, but when you're in it, there can be a lot of impatience, and obviously you want to get better, you want to feel better, you want to get back to your life. So I think it can feel very frustrating when you don't see the progress that you were expecting, and maybe your expectations were too high in the first place.
Yeah, I think realistic expectations is another really important thing. I think people set the bar really high for themselves, and it's really hard to match their expectations sometimes. So I think it's really important as a psychologist just to kind of let them know that mental health, it takes a long time to work through all this sort of stuff, and just acknowledge that it's going to be a long, difficult progress. There's going to be bumps in the road, but that's how you get to the other side and how you work through things.
Yeah, absolutely. So our last one then, I really like this one. Very short and sweet. You do you. So what comes to your mind when I say that?
So I've actually written down a quote for this one. I'm not sure who it's by, but it sums up kind of my thoughts about it, which is, you should just be yourself, not because it will make you more likable. It won't, but because it's only by being yourself that you'll find people who like you for who you really are, rather than for someone who you're pretending to be. So
That's lovely.
I think, yeah, it's one of my favorites, and I can't find out who it's by. It's an anonymous person, but my respect to whoever wrote that. But yeah, I think when we're playing the role of someone else, it's really easy for us to feel really lonely and disconnected, even if we're surrounded by people. I think that's why a lot of people go through their life, just feeling this sense of disconnection because they're being who other people want them to be as opposed to who they really want to be. And I think, you only live once. I think it's really important to do what you want to do and to make the most out of things. And, it's not going to please everyone. You're not going to get along with everyone. But I think it's just so important. And the friends that you do make are going to be, friends that like you for you if you are yourself as opposed to someone that you're trying to be.
Absolutely. And I think it can be really challenging, can't it, to sort of do you and be yourself to the outside world. And it can, as you say, it can take a long time to get to a place where you feel like you are being your authentic self. And maybe there's a bit of work that you need to do around, what is my authentic self? Like, who does that look like? What does that person do,
Yeah, I think we often lose sight of that. Like, we're so fixated on fitting in and living up to other people's expectations and doing what we think we should do as opposed to what we want to do and who we actually are. I think we often lose sight of who we are and just kind of follow the crowd sort of thing. So I think it's really important to do some work to figure out who am I and to embrace yourself, all your imperfections and your quirks, that's what makes you you. And I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah. And I think what can drive a lot of the insecurities and that kind of need to people please and to not wear what you want or be who you want is a sense of like not feeling good enough or having a not good enough story, like we like to say in ACT. And I've got an episode on that actually, episode 1. That's my first episode on the not good enough narrative and how to overcome it. So do go check that out. So we've talked about a lot today. I think we've done a really kind of good job on the sort of breadth of things, isn't it? In terms of like what can make mental health good and advice around mental health. So what have you found helpful in your life in terms of maintaining good mental health?
Yeah, so a lot of things, some that we've already discussed. I think the first one is, as a former personal trainer, I'm very big on the relationship between physical health and mental health. And I think prioritizing sleep and good nutrition and regular movement, they're great for physical health, but they can work wonders for your mental health and how you feel about yourself and how you function as well. So big crossover there. I think self-talk is hugely important. I think, as we've kind of discussed, we can be very critical towards ourselves, and that's just how our minds kind of naturally go about. But I think it's about, pushing pause, acknowledging that, figuring out where it came from, and learning to let that go and to treat yourself as you treat other people. And I think finally, I did a story about this on Instagram today, the importance of doing hard things and challenging yourself. And I actually used this podcast as an example, saying that, I was quite nervous, but, this is something that's an amazing opportunity and I'm so grateful. And I think growth only comes from challenging yourself and pushing through that resistance. Yeah. And I think it's so important for limiting beliefs. We form these beliefs like, I can't do this, I'm not good enough. And so a really powerful way to change these limiting beliefs is to prove to yourself that you can and to overcome these challenges. I think getting evidence. So I really support doing hard things and challenging yourself in slow, manageable steps, like not overwhelming yourself. But I use this podcast as an example of something that I was nervous about, but it was pushing through the resistance and doing hard things and trying to set a good example for the people that I'm giving advice to.
Absolutely. And you're so right, isn't it? And we don't grow if we don't push ourselves. If we don't go outside our comfort zones, if we always stay in the comfort zone, then we can't get evidence that, actually we can do something else, or we can do something better, or we can learn other things. And I've had the same process actually with this podcast. When I started, I hadn't even really listened to podcasts before in my life. So, the idea of doing a podcast just sort of came to me one day and I thought, that's a good idea. I didn't realize how much work it would be, but it's been a great experience. And, public speaking isn't my favorite thing to do, but it's been a great opportunity to get used to kind of being more visible I suppose, on things like social media and things. So yeah, it's so important, isn't it? And you can get a lot from it when you go outside your comfort zone, can't you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I've done a post on the stretch zone. I think if we push ourselves too far, it can derail and things might not go as planned. But there's this sweet spot, which is the stretch zone, where we're pushing ourselves a little bit, but it's not too overwhelming. So I think it's really important to kind of find that zone for yourself, to push yourself and challenge yourself, whatever that looks like for you, but just pursue meaningful goals. I think, anxiety is a normal part of being human, but that can really hold us back and make us avoid things that are really meaningful for us.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to push yourself because, there's risk involved, but it could lead to a really good outcome on the other side.
I love that idea of the stretch zone. I'm going to use that for myself.
Definitely not an original thing. I can't take credit for that, but
Okay.
it's good term. Yeah, it's helpful.
Yeah. Well, Sam, I really appreciate you being in your stretch zone in this podcast today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. As I said, I've been following you for a long time and I really enjoy your content and the messages that you provide. So
thank you.
I was very honored to be asked to join you. So thank you so much for having me.
And don't forget that your app comes out soon. So to be determined, but I'm sure you'll let everyone know once it's released.
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah, starting promotion soon. But yeah, in a few weeks' time, touch wood, hopefully everything goes okay.
Great. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hello Therapy. If you found it helpful, don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review. You can get more well-being and mental health tips by joining our email list and visiting the resources section of our website at harleyclinical.co.uk. The Hello Therapy podcast and the information provided by me, Dr. Liz White, is solely intended for information and educational purposes and does not constitute personalised advice. Please do reach out to your GP or a mental health professional if you need support. Until next time, take care of yourself.